why don't we begin? I'm Scott Sagan, Professor of Political Science, Co-Director here at Center for International Security and Cooperation. There are many people who are focusing on the war in Ukraine and what's going on with Russia, but there are many others who are focusing on what are the arms control implications for the downturn in U.S.-Russian relations and efforts to have arms control continue on and perhaps even address some of the concerns that are being raised because of the war in Ukraine. Miles Pomper is a senior fellow at the Washington, D.C. office of the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation, and William Moon is a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center, and they've been working most recently with Rose Gadamuller and others on an important piece of work on everything counts, building a control regime for non-strategic, often called kind of inappropriately tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. I'm acutely aware that this is a rare Mantle event that we're having here, but Rose was, as a co-author, was originally scheduled to be the host and asked me if I could sit in. It's really great to have Miles and William come to speak. They'll be speaking for 25 minutes or so. We'll do a round of questions, both here and from people calling in on Zoom. For those of you on Zoom, please write your questions in the Q&A, and I'll be calling on individuals online as well. So please, all yours.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks everyone for coming here and online. So, is there a way? How do I make this larger? Oh, slideshow. So to give you some background, as Scott said, we're talking about non-strategic, that is tactical nuclear warheads, as the press likes to label them. And as Rose would tell you, this was sort of one of the major issues that was left over from the New START agreement. When the Senate passed the resolution of ratification, they insisted that the next agreement include non-strategic nuclear warheads, which have never been part of any arms control agreement for various technical and political reasons. So just to give you some background on kind of why they were so insistent, this is a chart of the US and Soviet/Russian non-strategic nuclear warhead arsenals. There's two lines for the Russians because there were estimates of how many they had earlier. That's the red and orange lines. The blue line is the United States. And the current estimate is that Russia has about 20 times more non-strategic nuclear warheads than the United States deployed. So there's, or near deployment, I should say. So there's about 1,900, according to the Federation of American Scientists, on the Russian side, and only about 100 left in the US side, which are at 5 bases in Europe. So the report that Rose helped lead, and I was the principal investigator. It was the title that came up before, Everything Counts, and it was funded by 4 NATO members and 1 hopefully soon to be NATO member. That's Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. And we were looking at, to get the Europeans basically on board. This was launched, I should say, well before the invasion of Ukraine. So I was not as perspicacious as Scott gave us credit for. The idea was that this was going to come up in the negotiations between the US and Russia in the strategic stability talks, and the Europeans had to be brought aboard for the discussion. So we had sections focusing on the political, policy, legal, and technical issues that allies will likely have to address to reach an accord on non-strategic nuclear warheads. That is shorter range nuclear weapons, which have never been part of previous arms control agreements. And the Europeans have to be part of this because the weapons are actually based on their territory. So the inspections and those kind of measures would have to take place there, so they have to be included in a way that they don't have to be included in, say, the New START agreement. Previous arms control agreements only dealt with delivery systems, not the warheads themselves. That is, the missiles and the launchers were restricted. There was attribution rules to say how many warheads, make assumptions about how many warheads were on each launcher, but there was no actual counting of the warheads. And Bill will get into more of the reasons of why that's the case. The research team also carried out a series of interviews to understand the views of NATO states on such an agreement and to gauge the constraints they would be expected to face in the process, political, legal, and otherwise. Now, as I said, the interviews and primary drafting occurred before the Russia's February 22nd renewed invasion of Ukraine. We released the report at a conference in May in Copenhagen, which looked at how strategic stability has deteriorated since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But even at the conference, there was support for arms control, even though a lot of people were obviously very upset about what happened in Ukraine. The idea was that, it's not the moment now for doing arms control negotiations, obviously. But the New START treaty, which at that point had about 4 years to run, now is closer to 3, is going to expire in 2026, and we need to think about what comes afterwards. We need to be ready for the moment when some negotiations start again. And because of the resolution ratification in the US and the US policy, which says we want to deal with all nuclear warheads, strategic, non-strategic, including also stored warheads, non-stored, they're going to be part of a negotiation. So let's try to get the Europeans to do their homework, to get up to speed, to be ready for consultations within NATO when any negotiation takes place. Because they really haven't been thinking about arms control negotiations in a kind of detailed way since the INF treaty, and Steve could probably tell you more about that experience. To give you a sense of the table of contents, Rose wrote the introduction to the report. I wrote a section on background on US non-strategic nuclear weapons in NATO Europe. Nikolai Sokov wrote a very interesting chapter on the Russians' non-strategic nuclear posture. William Alberg, who was formerly the head of the NATO WMD office, helped lead the survey along with a bunch of other scholars looking at key stakeholders in key countries. William also worked with them on a chapter on policy issues related to verification. Marshall Brown, who was one of the legal advisors on a number of arms control agreements, including New START, wrote the chapter on legal issues, and Bill led a team looking at the technical issues, and he'll get into that in his presentation. So to give you an executive summary of the report, as I said, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Biden administration insisted that arms control negotiations with Russia cover all nuclear weapons, including non-strategic nuclear warheads. And the previous agreements had only focused on delivery vehicles. We can only expect, given the Russian threats, the nuclear threats, which often, they didn't specifically say tactical nuclear weapons, I should say, in these cases, but certainly the press and others interpreted that as threats of tactical nuclear weapons. Such demands can only be expected to grow, and so there's a need for NATO allies to be prepared. Some of the conclusions and recommendations: NATO allies want to keep existing non-strategic nuclear warheads, and they want an agreement limiting Russian non-strategic warheads, and they expect to be substantively consulted before each round of negotiations. Russia's behavior has helped reinforce allied views that maintaining the NATO's current nuclear sharing arrangements is the right approach. And I know Steve and others are familiar with the debate about 10 years ago, where there was a real internal debate within NATO about whether the alliance should keep up the nuclear sharing approach. Particularly the Germans and others were looking to, considering kind of pulling out some of those arrangements. The invasion of Ukraine, no doubt, has reinforced some allies' doubts about the value of any arms control agreements with Russia. Can they be trusted? And so all allies need to be reassured that arms control and deterrence do not clash, but actually complement each other, that arms control is a way of steering deterrence and making it more effective. In terms of the Russian arsenal, most of their arsenal today supports specific missions. They're particularly important in the Navy, where Russia's much inferior to the US forces, and they serve as a backup to its emerging long-range conventional capability, which is, as we've seen in this war, is not as strong as some had anticipated. And it's not likely to be bargained away by the Russians. But there are some systems that, such as the nuclear missile defense interceptors around Moscow, that could be bargained away now that Russia's more capable conventional missile defense systems like the S-500. I think we should also be, people tend to look at, when they talk about arms control, to look at numbers. I think here the numbers are less important than the transparency. We don't know anything about these systems right now. And so, and Bill will get into this in more detail, any information that we can have will be reassuring and stabilizing compared to what we have at the present moment. Addressing non-strategic nuclear warheads will require overcoming operational and technical verification challenges that are made more difficult by issues of information security, definitions, and stockpile disparities. The experience in implementing the INF Treaty and other agreements and inspections regimes to which many NATO allies are party, and this is important, it's not, there were only a few basing countries that were involved in the INF agreement, but all NATO members are parts of some inspection regime. Vienna document, other parts of arms control regimes, OPCW things, and so on. So they provide a useful starting point for considering how the new treaty might be implemented and practical experience in preparing to host Russian inspectors. In advance of negotiations, allies should carry out a legal assessment to determine how domestic laws might need to be amended to carry out on-site inspections and other measures on their territory. And this is, when we talk about doing their homework, this is the kind of measure. You can do this now while there's no arms control negotiations take place to get a stock taking of both legal measures and a technical capability assessment to determine how they might need to improve their staffing of national verification entities to implement an agreement. And one thing that we certainly learned in doing the research on this project was just how knowledge, even within the more experienced NATO members, those in Western Europe who were involved in the INF agreement, the capabilities, technical capabilities have really withered since that point. And they're all talking about how they need additional capabilities to do technical work. And that leaves out even, the Eastern European countries, which were not part of NATO and they were never involved as part of the Warsaw Pact or others in the US-Soviet talks. So there's, a lot of capacity building that has to be done there. Allies will also need to enhance the analytical and legal capabilities of their foreign and defense ministries when it comes to non-strategic warheads and arms control. And we actually just had a really great course in October that Rose and Sig Hecker and others were part of, which was training junior and mid-level people from NATO members in arms control, deterrence, and verification, trying to build some expertise there. Finally, sustained political engagement at the highest level will be essential to the success of any arms control initiative involving allies. And this is the link here for the report. It's on our website. And with that, I will turn it over to Bill to talk about some of the technical dimensions of our work.
Thank you, Miles. As we're calling up the slides, I'm a practitioner, spent my career in the Department of Defense, so I have to have PowerPoint slides. Sorry about that. That's how I was trained to speak. It's not on. There we go. And I just hit return. Okay. First, I want to thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Miles asked me to join the team based on my experience working with the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program for 25 or so years, where I work closely with the 12th Main Directorate of the Russian Ministry of Defense. We help them to secure their warheads, strategic, non-strategic, the entire inventory of warheads. The 12th Main Directorate is the component within Department of Defense. They own all of the warheads that are in storage. They own all the assets of the bases where the bunkers are. They own the bunkers at the deployed sites and all of the infrastructure involved in it. So there's not a equivalent on the US side. They're working with them for 25 plus years, sort of informed this study. And while Miles told you about the study, we started working on non-strategics. What I'm going to talk to you about today on nuclear warheads could apply to any warheads when it comes to arms control verification. And I need to acknowledge Dan Zhukov was a key member of our technical team as we worked on this concept. You heard from Miles. Biden administration is interested in the next phase of arms control, addressing all weapons, strategic, intermediate, tactical. Previous treaties only dealt with the delivery systems with no direct warheads, accounting and tracking the warheads themselves, and certainly nothing on non-strategic. Our program, however, worked on all warheads, strategic and non-strategic. During the Trump administration, there was an initiative to propose freezing warhead stockpile inventories. Actually, there was a temporary agreement from President Putin to do so, but that broke down. Efforts failed when they tried to implement any kind of verification measures. Trump administration's intent was to put a system around the production sites so that you could see how many go in, how many go out, and freeze it in that way. But those of us who worked with the Russians for years knew that such a monitoring system at the production facility is something we worked over 20 years to try and work with the Russians, and something that they never agreed to. We're pretty adamant not to allow. So we tried to look at this as developing, how can we do a step-by-step approach to arms control, looking at verification of warheads themselves. So we started with, well, where do you start from when it comes to warheads? So we looked at developing a methodology to actually track and account individual warheads. Seems like that might be a simple thing, right? Well, you just look at a serial number. No, it's not that simple, because a warhead's made up of components. What do you actually put the serial number on? Do you put it on the container? Do you put it on a primary? Do you put it on a secondary? Where do you put it? There's no place to actually put a serial number. There are many serial numbers on systems, but there is not a single way to do that. So that's sort of our starting point in looking at trying to establish any kind of arms control agreement that directly accounts for warheads. So you need to start with a methodology to tag or track individual warheads throughout their service life if you're going to have any kind of agreement governing warheads. It's got to be done without revealing sensitive information. The key sensitivities are design, how are the components put together, the composition, what's in each of those components, and the performance of the warhead. Those are the things that neither side wants to reveal to one another, and we don't want to actually ask for that sort of thing, right? We also have to be mindful not to create nuclear safety or security vulnerabilities. It was really important when we worked with the Russians to help them secure and eliminate their warheads. Whatever we did, need to make sure that it didn't cause safety issues, disruption, and certainly no security vulnerabilities. And I'll get to some examples of how we worked around that. And what's really sensitive is identifying where a warhead is located at the present moment. Not so sensitive to know a warhead was at a location several years ago from a security perspective, that's okay. But knowing where it is today, that's a sensitivity. And we don't want to disrupt warhead operations. So these are really, when we started the idea of tracking and accounting for system, these are the requirements that we started looking at. The challenges of verifying warheads, I started talking about a little bit about this. Warheads are relatively small. They're very mobile. In the Russian system, we worked with them. We supported between 6 and 8 train loads of warhead shipments per month at the height of our cooperation. A train load, okay, one car might have 3 super containers. A super container may have 1 to 3 warheads in it. And a train load might have 6 to 12 cars, transport cars associated with it. So 6 to 8 every month. That's a high pace and mobility of warheads, to give you a sense of how frequent the movements are on the Russian side. Much less frequent on our side. We have to be concerned about safety, security, maintenance. A lot of their movements are for safety and security reasons. On-site inspection, going to sites to look at warheads, is very intrusive, raises a lot of safety and security concerns. We negotiated an agreement where we went to each of these nuclear warheads storage sites. We were allowed 3 visits, total 3 visits for the site during the time of our cooperation. When we went in there, there's no electronics, no video, no metal whatsoever. Even if our boots had metal, we had to change them out. I had to wear Russian boots a couple of times because mine were too nice. Had steel toes and so forth. When I couldn't bring in a watch, and we didn't even go inside the bunkers. This was just around the bunkers, looking at the security systems that we put in. So very, very sensitive about anything like that. Yeah, in order to get a watch, I'd have to put mine in a safe. After I got out of a van, they would hand me a watch to take so that I knew how much time was left in our visit. Even if you can get inside a bunker, direct observation is really impossible. I say difficult here, but it's really impossible. Warheads are stored in containers, often containers within containers. We provided them super containers for the specialized containers to go inside of. So if you think about it from the arms control inspection provision, even if you got in there, what would you look at? Well, you can't just lift these containers and look under them. So a super containers is 1 ton. And there's no physical room to lift them up within a bunker. You'd have to remove it from the bunker, take it out, get a crane to lift it, because they're not made for security and safety reasons. They're not made to be able to be looked at. You don't want access to it. So this is important things to consider when looking at an arms control verification regime. So direct observation is really difficult, and it creates a lot of challenges that make it difficult to tag or attach anything to a warhead or component. A lot of verification R&D up to this point is focused on, well, we could take radiation emanation measurements. Well, that can be done scientifically, but the security concerns are really, it's really a high bar to be able to do that in a way where you know that it's a warhead, identify one warhead from another one without getting into the sensitivity of design, composition, and performance, which is really key. So, all right, how do we deal with these problems? Well, turns out we asked the question, well, how does DoD and MOD keep track of their warhead inventories today? Right? That might be a good place to start. Well, turns out we actually worked with the Russians and helped them to develop the inventory management system that the 12th Main Directorate uses, as far as I know, still uses today. It was designed by them with our assistance and cooperation with the program in the Defense Threat Reduction Agency where I worked. It's a program called Diamonds. That's the warhead inventory system that the Department of Defense uses for all the warheads that are non-deployed, all of them in storage, during transportation, and so forth. So their system was actually designed with a lot of the same ideas and concepts, and through technical exchanges between the Diamonds program in the US and the ACOMS program, which is simply automated inventory control and management system within the 12th Main Directorate. The systems are actually quite similar in terms of their data structures, what they look at, and how they keep track of warheads. Well, it turns out we don't track warheads by one simple serial number. There's a serial number for every single component that's tracked in the system. If you were to look at the inventory systems today, and I'll show you a picture in a minute, what it looks like. It's essentially a warhead is defined by a list of transactions conducted for an individual warhead over its lifetime. That data is essentially the identifier of what one warhead is over another, because no 2 warheads are ever in their lifetime at the same place, exact same time, for the same period, looked at by the same people, and so forth. Each warhead has its own life cycle data associated with it. And during CTR and during mill-to-mill exchanges with the Russians, a lot of that kind of data that is compiled and used to manage inventories was exchanged between our parties. We went to all of their storage sites. I brought Russians to several of ours, not all of ours, but a couple of our warhead storage facilities. We shipped warheads to dismantlement from those storage sites. Well, that was pretty sensitive, right? But here's how we did it. 30 days after the shipment occurred, the Russians would give us an invoice and say, please pay the transporter for a shipment of these warheads 1,472 kilometers on this date and time. That was 30 days ago. That met their requirements because it was time in the past, wasn't current. And we, through NTM and other resources, could verify, oh, that shipment actually took place and it was the right kind of shipment to the right kind of location that was okay with us. And the Russians knew that, acknowledged it, and we were able to work together. So the precedent of being able to exchange this kind of information has been set through previous mill-to-mill and cooperative engagements like cooperative threat reduction. We even talked to them about components. We held a mill-to-mill exchange in Albuquerque, talked about things like primaries. How do you store warheads? Do you store your airdrop warheads? Are they on the pylons when they're in storage? Are they not attached to the pylons? Turns out ours are and theirs aren't. This was part of the exchange. So we actually talked about some things like components. And when they shipped their warheads to dismantlement, they took off the limited lifetime components. These are like the tritium bottles. They're boosters. They took them off the warheads before shipping to dismantlement. This is for safety and security reasons. And they shared that information with us, and we actually paid for some of those separate shipments of tritium bottles that went to dismantlement facilities. And we talked about security checks and inventory management. So the point here is there is a precedent for exchanging this kind of information. This kind of historical data is not as sensitive as design, composition, or performance. It has been exchanged, and it can be used to create a unique identifier. And we've used the term in our studies, calling it a warhead passport, which is this set of data that shows a warhead's life cycle. We use the word passport because when we started working with the Russians on inventory management, we said, well, how do you manage it now, right? Started off with, they said, oh, we have this little thing that is like a notebook. It goes everywhere a warhead goes. And we take good, really close care and attention on every time anybody looks at it, touches it, changes a component. And we call it a warhead passport. That's a pretty cool concept. So we've used this in our study as well. And basically what it is it's the life cycle of the warhead. And that composition of that data is actually unique to each warhead and can be used then to identify individual warheads. How would that look? Don't look at all the data on here. What I want you to see is there are data on date, time, location, status. The things that I just mentioned, each of them can be composed and gathered. If you were to look at the ACOMs or the diamonds, the Russian and the US inventory system, it would look like a lot like this. A bunch of codes showing those locations. The status is a warhead reserve. Is it going to dismantlement? Is it scheduled for dismantlement? A lot of really interesting information. There, of course, be a lot more in our inventory system because every little check, every screw that's turned would be managed. But this is an example of the kind of data that could be exchanged. And there's actually quite a bit of it. That's what I want you to take from this picture is there's quite a bit of data that would be unique for each individual warhead. And location codes, we've had discussions before on it, status components. Operations are important. Operations are shipments, road, rail, and air, the kinds of things you can see through NTM, or at least see parts of through NTM. So pieces of these things can be verified through an arms control agreement. So you can start to see where our thinking and how it evolved, coming from how does the US and Russia manage their inventories today, and how can we use that to apply it to an arms control agreement? So if you got that idea, we wouldn't want to share all of it though. If you shared everything all up front on an individual warhead, now you're getting into things like performance and how long is the life cycle. You don't, but can you share some of it? That was our key question. And we met with some great experts like Dr. Martin Hellman here at Stanford, and said, well, how can we share some of it, but not all of it? And he suggested cryptography as a way that we can do this. In other words, cryptography can be used to capture that history, commit it. We can use a hash code then to provide a unique identifier of that data. And a hash is not encryption, right? You guys probably know about hash codes better than I do. We've got a key expert's been working on our team here, Neil Perry, who's actually developed hash codes based on notional data we presented for a contract for the State Department. So the hash function just creates this code that can be used as to identify, capture, and commit that data, one warhead from another over its entire life cycle. So this can be tracked. No two data sets will be the same. They're like unique fingerprints. And think about this. This is just data that's already collected and much of which has been exchanged before. You don't have to take emanations and measurements and that sort of thing. And so you can create these hash codes, has all this life cycle data in it. And now you can start talking about the idea of exchanging data on warheads. So let me jump ahead. I'm taking a little bit too much time. So the data that you saw before, all I want you to take from this is, well, everything above that red line could be represented by that hash code in that far right column just above the red. That's a hash code that represents everything above it, right? And then as a warhead undergoes different operations over its life cycle, you have that previous hash code, you create a new hash code with that transaction data. Okay, so now we're starting to get into sort of arms control and how arms control is done. What would a baseline database look like? Simply a list of hash codes with your initial data and every update. So a baseline data exchange would be essentially a ledger of hash codes. So, and then I'll talk about in a minute how you could help validate and gain confidence in that. So our process here, we're trying to build the idea of bottom up. And I think Rose has talked about this a lot. She talked about it to our NATO counterparts that maybe the next stage of arms control is not to have a presidential agreement that we are going to freeze and then how do you do it and how do you verify it? Rather, here's some things that we can do to verify. Now, what kind of agreements might we achieve with it? That's more of a bottom-up approach, and that's how we've approached this study. So you could start with a baseline, sides exchange a ledger like I just talked about. The data updates or the notifications, each a hash code. And then the key here, which I'll talk about in a minute, is a data challenge. A data challenge is how you could go about revealing pieces of that data enough so that you can have confidence that each unique one is a unique warhead. And you can start to gain insight into each of the individual warheads. That data would be revealed not all up front like we're used to in previous arms control treaties, but step-by-step process. Each challenge gives a little bit more open window and a little bit more confidence as you go throughout this process. So it would be built cooperatively between the parties. Step-by-step is one of the terms we used in doing cooperative threat reduction with the Russians. Started really slow. Folks forget that now. They talk about all the great stuff that was done, but that was 20 years. It took 3 years after the original CTR agreement before we even were allowed to meet face-to-face with the 12th Main Directorate. These things were very step-by-step. In fact, it was a year after we signed the agreement before we actually got into technical talks. It was mostly Harold Smith talking to General Maslin over that first year just to gain confidence. So each time you reveal a little bit of data, you gain a little bit more confidence. Here's a depiction of that data challenge process. I don't want to go into the details too much, but I think you've already got the idea. I hope host party derives the hash from the passport data. The hash is committed electronically and through mathematical proof to the observing party through that hash code. And then the observing party can issue a challenge, say, give me the location of red one on this date in the past 5 years ago, right? The host party will decommit. Then you run it through the electronic process of validating the hash code, running the proof, and you gain little by little insight into each individual warhead, and you gain confidence in the overall ledger as you go. The cryptographic commitment is immutable. It's one way. So when you go through that proof, you're gaining confidence. And the thing is that the data challenges can be designed to correlate with NTM or other data you already know about a warhead. Maybe you've seen, and this is what we did on the CTR, maybe you've seen that there was a rail transfer shipment conducted at the Saratov rail transfer point, which is one of the places that we went, one of the first ones I went to. Maybe we saw that 5 years ago. Well, if you can get that revealed through behind the cryptographic commitment, it gives you a good amount of confidence. Hey, we saw that 5 years ago, and now that data is coming back to us. So you're gaining confidence as you go. So I want to emphasize here what we've done so far. This is not creating a total verification regime. This is a concept to start and a step-by-step bottom-up approach, not a comprehensive solution, but working together. We think if we had an opportunity to work with the Russians, you'd want to develop this process together with them, as opposed to having a solution and say, here it is, take it or leave it or negotiate it. Each one of those steps, which data you use, how often you exchange it, all of those things would have to be negotiated and worked on together. But remember, this is data that's already being collected by both sides. It has to be, right? In fact, those inventory management systems better damn well be pretty good because we're relying on them to keep track of warheads. So our approach is to do it step by step in such a way that you're building confidence over time, as opposed to, can we verify it all up front? No, it's a step-by-step process. And then how would you use this? Well, you could apply this to entire inventory. When we started off with the study, we were doing it with the idea that maybe we would look at maybe the sites along the western border of Russia. Maybe the non-strategic sites would be of interest, and we would exchange data site by site. It could be done by status of warheads, because we talked about status and how that can be talked about. Are we really worried about the warheads that have had their bottles, their booster bottles removed from them and the batteries taken out? Are they really of concern, or how much of concern are they? And if you know which ones are in that status, that can help you develop ideas on how to use this methodology to apply to whatever agreement you might want to come up with. So it could be applied in a lot of different ways. And we're working with the State Department. We have 2 contracts with them to develop this concept further. Just wrapping it up. Sorry, it's gone a little long. We've actually developed notional passports for them. We're doing a proof of concept demonstration. Neil and Dan are going to be there at the CNS headquarters on December 13th to a pretty high level group of DOD, DOE, and State Department folks. And we're gonna show them how this would work using notional data, how hash codes are built, how a SNARK tool might be produced, which is another tool that can check on data, on the validity of data without actually revealing it, and so forth. Then we've got a follow-on contract to take this concept and develop what could be a possible verification regime for warheads that could be applied to future agreements. So let me wrap it up there and say thank you and look forward to your questions and discussion.
Well, thank you, Bill. I'm going to ask one quick question, and then I'm going to ask fellows and others in the room to raise their hand. And also we have some 40 people on Zoom, including former arms control negotiators, former NSC officials, former Congressional Research Service officials. So there'll be, I think, some interesting questions from that group as well. In the past, when we had discussions about future arms control, you could get feelings about what the Russians thought about this because there are so many dialogues going on with the Russians. That's much harder today. Can you say anything about any reactions from Russians informally or through any of the very few existing Track 2 outlets that are going on?
I'll start and you can add if you want. So as you know, Rose is part of the joint National Academy of Sciences, U.S.-Russian National Academy of Sciences panel on international security and arms control. I guess the other CSAC.
The other CSAC, the National Academy of Sciences CSAC.
So we presented it to them, and we actually got a very positive reaction, especially for Russians, as Bill probably tell you, they don't tend to have positive reactions at first, and they said it was very interesting. So that's at least somewhat of an indicator. We haven't. One thing we'd really like to be able to do is talk to some people who are cryptology experts on the Russian side, which we haven't been able to do yet. But I think there's at least enough that people will be willing to have some discussions on it.
Yeah, and just to follow up, they had some technical experts there, and they said they didn't outright reject this idea, which to me, in my experience, was when you meet with the Russians, the first time they reject it, the second time they'll ask you questions and tell you you're stupid, and then the third time they might consider it. In this case, they actually started off with, well, that might be worth talking about a little bit. And I also want to say that this is based, the approach is a little different in that it's something that we would want to work together to develop with them as opposed to giving them or trying to negotiate the answer. And it's based on previous cooperation, which even though the Russians declined to extend the CTR agreement, the cooperation was really quite strong up until 2013. And those people are still there. I mean, we know the people that are running the ACOMS program in Russia. So we have some experience that we think could benefit. So that's some reason for optimism, but of course, trying to talk today is really difficult. The Russians overtly said no more meeting with the 12th Maine Directorate. They refused any mill-to-mill exchanges, which we tried to pursue in 2014. So that is a big thing that needs to be overcome in terms of working with them.
Naomi, if you could, everybody introduce themselves first for the benefit of our speakers and for the audience on Zoom.
Well, hi, I'm Naomi Eagle. I'm a postdoc fellow here at CSAC. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think the report is fantastic as well. I wanted to ask you about the interviews in Europe and about sort of more specifically what substantive consultations would involve. That the report mentioned several times that informing allies after the fact is not enough. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate on what the ideas about what these substantive consultations would involve. Does that mean seeking consensus or requiring consensus within NATO on specific proposals? And somewhat relatedly, but a bit more broadly, to what extent is NATO and discussions within NATO different now versus the INF discussions? Is it harder to get agreement in NATO, or are points of difference different? So sort of the similarities and differences between discussions within NATO during INF versus now.
Yeah, so the first question was on the consultative mechanism, right? So NATO had a special consultative group during the INF negotiations, and the basic idea is that before each round of negotiations and after each round of negotiations, the U.S. government would consult with the allies and try to integrate their views into the negotiating position with the Russians. And that's basically, that kind of consultation, intense consultation, is what we would be advocating for here. And you can imagine different ways of structuring that. I mean, you have a much larger NATO than you had back in the day. And so that you could imagine a core group, which would include the countries with dual capable aircraft, that is the aircraft capable of launching the B-61 tactical bombs, would be part of it, and maybe a couple of, the UK and France, for instance, part of that group. And then maybe a wider group around that of all NATO members. But that's a political decision that NATO would have to make about what makes. I think in terms of what's different and what's similar, I'd say the the big difference is that size. I mean, just NATO is such a larger organization than it was there. And you've got this big split, which is, the Russians have helped paper over, but to a certain extent with the Ukraine invasion, but between the West and the East, where, one of the things the study said is, the further you get east, the balance is deterrence is very strong and arms control is very weak. You go west, especially in Germany before the war, it was kind of stopping at France, I guess, but you get more deterrence and less arms control. I mean, more arms control and less deterrence. And so, on the one hand, at least for now, the issue doesn't have the same political salience that it had back in the 80s when it was kind of the key, nuclear weapons were higher on the agenda, and it was huge protests in the United States and in Europe. So that the public opinion part is probably less. I mean, we'll see if it ever comes to that, but conceivably it'd be less important than it was then. But then you've got the inter-NATO challenge of just navigating all these countries, particularly the Eastern European members who are going to be much more recalcitrant about any agreement. So, different challenges, but none of them are easy. And Steve probably talk a little bit more about that than I could being there. But
Just let me add to that, that as we were developing the technical approach, we were very cognizant of the importance that NATO consultations would have to be involved in a bottom-up approach. And so as we were developing things like, well, what would our NATO partners be interested in? Well, understanding whether the warhead inventory, how much of that composition is actually active or inactive, stockpile, the distribution of locations, that sort of information is information they may be interested in, and in which we recognize would need to have discussions with the Russians on what of those things that we were exchanging bilaterally could and should be shared with allies.
I should also add that, unlike INF, I mean, the INF primarily was, in terms of the allies, relied on basing agreements with the host countries, between the US and the host countries, about access and things like that. The challenge you have here is because of tactical weapons can be moved so easily, you basically have all NATO members, whether or not they currently host weapons, are going to have to be subject to this, and the Russians would likely insist on that. So it's a broader participation than you had in the INF agreement.
Miriam.
Hi, I'm Miriam Barnum, also postdoc at CSAC. Thank you for this excellent discussion. You already answered one of my questions, which is sort of about the
Then we can only ask one then.
information asked one. But I have a couple.
He's got it.
Okay.
Down from 5. Yeah.
Two small questions about the technical process. So one is, and I know these things might be sort of negotiated in the process of developing an arms control agreement based on this, but what do you anticipate being sort of the level of granularity at which individual data points or transactions are turned into hash codes, because presumably that affects the amount of data that would have to be revealed in a single data challenge to verify a single data point. And then what's sort of the time delay that might be acceptable, because presumably for a data challenge, you wouldn't want to reveal, the data point that's about where the warhead is right now.
Yeah, those are great questions. And I think you answered part of them yourself, which is that there would have to be a time delay. Our experience on working with Russians to pay an invoice of shipments that were already conducted, that was 30 days. So we should look at that as a minimum and should negotiate from that point on in terms of the location and an action that has been conducted. And in our process, we're actually just had some discussions today about how much of that would we be revealing upfront and how much would be revealed over time. And so it's actually a step-by-step within a step-by-step, because what you could do is you could give the hash code when a transaction occurs, but then give the proof to the transaction 30 days later and do decommitment, and then you negotiate the data challenge. So very, very much involved in negotiating those sort of things so that both sides are comfortable from a security perspective while also getting the information that they need. In terms of granularity, that is what we presented there, the locations and transactions, those are our initial assessments of the data that we think could be exchanged based on our previous mill-to-mill exchanges. And one of the reasons why the State Department wants us to do the proof of concept is so you can actually see that and see, is that enough data to develop a hash code that protects that data well enough that it couldn't just be guessed at and developed based on your knowledge of warhead life cycle. So we look at a dozen or so different data sets that would likely be extracted from the actual inventory management systems. But as you said, we'd have to negotiate that and decide exactly which ones and how much of the data to share and to be captured within the warhead tracking system.
Julie George over in that corner.
Hi, my name is Julie George. I'm a predoctoral fellow at CSAC and at the Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. Thanks so much for your presentation. I found it very insightful, and I'd like to follow up on your last slide, where there was a bullet point about adding imagery or photos to the ledger to increase for confidence building measures. Sorry for the doom and gloom of this question, but I was wondering if your team has thought of ways in which imagery or videos could be spoofed, manipulated through generative adversarial networks, and ways to combat that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So yeah, I didn't get into that too much during the presentation, but we had a lot of experience using the exchange of photos to verify contractual work that was done on a cooperative threat reduction. So let me give you an example I talk about sometimes during this presentation is when we went to our third visit to a site, we were allowed inside of a control room, and we wanted to know that the equipment to detect an intruder actually worked, not just that it was there, right? That it actually worked. So what we do is, as a team lead, I would take a piece of paper and I would write a signature or write something, and I would hand it to one of the guards. The guard would go out on a perimeter. Wouldn't know exactly which perimeter, but would then shake the fence, and so that we in the control room could see that the alarm assessed within the right amount of time. Is it a 2-second delay, a 5-second delay, et cetera? We had criteria for that, and that we could see it, and it was actually the thing I just handed to them. They couldn't have made that up because it was happened within minutes, right? So that's an example of video or photos that could be used to verify things. So under an arms control agreement, it might be that a host country does something like that when a warhead is transferred from a truck to a train, right? We wouldn't be able to see that through NTM, but maybe if they took that video and so forth. And so your next part of the question, which is a good one too, which is, well, how do you know it's not spoofed or so forth? And there's work being done. We met with AWE in the UK. They're actually doing some work about using cryptography to help validate photos and video. Now, that's still a lot of work to be done on that. And the next phase, the next contract that we're going to work on for the State Department is going to look at exactly those kind of applications and see if it can be integrated with the warhead tracking system in a way that any kind of photo or video that is then attributed to an individual warhead would be captured within the database and could be validated and verified through a data challenge down the line to increase your confidence even more. So more to do on that. That's the right question.
Paul Edwards has a question online. I'll summarize it. He asked whether this is an unfair question, but I think it's totally fair. Just given the state of U.S.-Russian relations because of the war in Ukraine, what can you imagine could recreate enough what you called building confidence to even start in this process? Are there historical precedents that you're thinking about or are there just enormous changes in the Russian government that would be required to?
Well, this is the time I get to channel Rose. So, Rose was basically spoke on this question at the Copenhagen meeting, and I mean, her feeling was, first of all, you have to get a ceasefire or some kind of real, the war has to be in some kind of limbo at the very least to even begin negotiations, um, to get political talks going. But I think part of the advantage of this step-by-step thing is you don't even have to wait for the governments. I mean, you could conceivably start with expert talks, even before official meetings. And we've sort of been encouraged by people in the government to pursue that path, to at least have some ideas out there. Like you were saying, get some Russians talking about this approach and get people, and then you can start the verification efforts before you even have an agreement. So you don't have to wait for all the negotiations to go
It would
forward.
also be worth, just by analogy, thinking about the state of Russian-American relations during the Vietnam War, when we knew that the Russians were arming people who were killing lots of Americans, and were even helping out in some of that more directly than was publicly known. And yet, arms control issues were still going forward. But that's a political question, not when dealing with the Russians, but dealing with Congress and the American public.
I mean, I think there's still, everything I've seen is that neither side wants to abandon New START. So it's a question of when do you find the moment. But it's got to be sometime before 2026, or you need some kind of political agreement to at least keep the current agreement in place or something.
And we do have the precedent of having worked with the Russians on the technical level during times of political crisis. Now, Kosovo is not quite as tense as now by any means. But our experience in cooperative threat reduction, I think, is illustrative in that, when we had the attack at the airport, the Russians were very upset. They essentially shut down CTR. But at a technical level, I was able to call my counterpart, who told me no technical team meetings for a month, no senior level meetings for 3.5 months, and then we can start resuming. And so the idea is to try and get at least that kind of a forum started at a technical level that could help build a bottom-up approach. That seems like a more possible pathway than waiting for a political solution.
Or
Thank you so much for a great talk. My name is Olivia Vinovich. I'm visiting. Sorry.
take this so that they can hear you.
Thank you. I'm an Israel Studies fellow here. I'm visiting associate professor from the Hebrew University. I have 1.5 questions. One, do you think you can discern any differences between different bodies within the Russian community, as we call it? Are there any differences between people in the military, people in the government? And of course, this relates to before the Russian war. It's impossible to tell different groups now. And do you think there may be potential allies within one of the communities that are more likely to work along these lines than others? I'm trying to discern the different actors that could be relevant for the discussion. And my other question, did you make any progress in terms of the conceptual, legal, analytical framework for the terms non-strategic nuclear weapons and short-range nuclear weapons? We all know sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't. The press likes to call them tactical, but we don't have good definitions for them. Thank you.
I'll answer the second one. Bill, why don't you answer the first one?
Yep.
We did the easy thing, which was we defined non-strategic weapons as those that hadn't been subject to any other arms control agreement.
Okay. Certainly, different bodies within the Russian government have different interests and different cultures. 12th Main Director is very different than Roscosmos. I've worked with both of them. They're much more serious. What I would say is I'm going to give you the warhead perspective, since that's mostly what we're talking about here, right? From a warhead perspective, you can go back to the presidential nuclear initiatives in the early 90s. These were unilateral initiatives that actually led to thousands and thousands of warheads being eliminated, reduced, and where the Russians pledged to move all their warheads from deployment sites to central storage. Although that may not mean what you think it means, it probably means that it's within the custody of the 12th Maine Directorate. That's my own personal view of what that means, but others may differ a little bit. But when you think about warheads, you need to think it's not just the personalities of the different organizations, but what are the interests? And you have Russian interests in having warheads for their deterrence and to threaten and perhaps coerce. But they also have a responsibility, and they do take this responsibility seriously for the safety and security of that inventory. They're very sensitive about talking to non-nuclear weapon states about their warheads, how they're operated, and so forth. And so part of our approach here is to take advantage of that and say, hey, we acknowledge that you have safety and security concerns, and perhaps we could talk about things that could be used to share more data on warhead locations or pullbacks that may be in your interest as well. One of the things that has concerned me has been a couple of sites I went to in Belgorod and right on the Ukrainian border. I talked about how often warheads are moved regularly. I don't know what's happening there, but what is the 12th Maine Directorate concerned about right now? They can't be doing normal operations. If they were, the Ukrainians would probably be trying to bomb them because it would look like they were shipping warheads to deployment sites because trucks would be coming out of there. So they are today, they must be altering their operations in some way. So the 12th Maine Directorate has got to be concerned about that. We have seen videos of them moving emergency response vehicles to the east. And that's what it was emergency response vehicles, not warheads, to shore up security. So thinking about Russian interests and like the 12th Maine Directorate interested in safety and security of the warheads, they certainly wouldn't want to risk that in any way during war operations. And perhaps there may be ways to take advantage of that in a way that we could cooperatively work, as Rose is wonderful at saying, you know, we need to work with them on the threat of nuclear war, and the Ukrainians work with them on ending the current war. And those are some of the ways that we can and should work with them to ensure that they can keep their warheads safe and secure, even from any conflict today. And understanding the different organizations and what their interests are, I think, is an important way to do that. Unfortunately, they've deliberately cut off communications right now. So the first step would be to reestablish some of those communications.
We've hit the end of the hour. With apologies to Amy Wolf, I hope, who's asking good questions online. I hope you'll send the questions to Miles and Bill, and to Steve Pfeiffer, who's here. I hope you can stay afterwards and get your questions. I think we should end it, and just please join me in thanking Bill and Miles for this very interesting talk, but most importantly, for the very important report.
Thanks, Eric.